All right, I want to welcome everyone and sorry that we've got a little bit of a technical today getting a couple of our panelists on board. So we're going to be having them come in here pretty soon. So I want to thank you all for joining us today. My name's Scott Lord. I'm the co-chair of the technical committee for the Partner Alliance for Safer Schools. And today we're going to talk about applying for school safety grants. So I want to welcome you all and appreciate you being here. Just a quick agenda. We're going to talk a little bit about who is PASS for those of you who may not know, why PASS was created and what we do with that. Then I'm going to introduce my panelists. Hopefully, I'll have all of them at that point. Then we're going to kind of do an intro to grants, kind of a high level view of what to look for, how the PASS guidelines can work to help create those narratives when you're looking for grants, what kind of grants to look for. Then we're going to take a small break and then dive into the grants deeper as far as what to look for, how to plan those, things of that sort. So with that, we're going to go ahead and get kicked off. If you do have any questions, please feel free to put those in the chat and we will get to them as we do. So for those of you who don't know, the Partner Alliance for Safer Schools was created over 10 years ago, back in 2014, to really provide school administrators, boards, public safety, and security professionals with the information to implement and secure school safety. One of the biggest things that we see in our industry is that there isn't anything for schools to have, either from a code perspective or really from a strategy perspective, on how to implement security and best practices in the schools. So that's why PASS was created. So we wanted to look at taking resources across the country, looking at schools, chief of police, Safe and Sound Schools as an example, as one of the organizations that we work with, to really kind of bring those individuals together and provide a resource to really help schools better understand how to implement school safety and how to do it in a strategic and a holistic approach. And really, one of the reasons why we put this together is because it's a huge challenge with schools. You know, when we look at the unique things that schools have to work with as far as the threats that are there, as well as when we first began, we really didn't have a security team, and what did that look like? And so bringing in all of those stakeholders, when you're looking at the fact that we need IT support, that we have our parents, we have our emergency responders, our students that have to be involved when we're talking about safety and security, our administration, how we're budgeting for that, as well as having an integration team of how do we put that all together? How do we have these policies and processes all work together with the technology that's coming in there? And then to further confuse it, we have all these different systems. You know, and we talk about mass notification and we talk about access control and how these all operate together and visitor management and how all of those kind of come together as what may look like disparate systems, but they're all part of that security plan and that security overview. And so what we wanted to do is to try to help provide kind of something to help, be able to plan and prepare and put in place really the policy and procedures, the people and roles that are required in school safety, and help develop that team. And then from there, being able to start tackling how do we put these systems in a holistic manner. So that's a quick view of who we are as PASS. I'm going to introduce a couple of our panelists, and then hopefully Elisa and Guy, they're having a little bit of trouble getting into the webinar, so we should be able to have them hopefully shortly. So Jill, I'm going to start with you. Jill, you want to tell us a little bit about your background and what you do?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Scott. I appreciate the opportunity today to participate in this webinar, and specifically on school grant, security grants for school security. It's really an important endeavor. So I'm glad we're going to have all these genius brains on this panel, and me. So I am the segment development manager for the education vertical for Access Communications. I've been with Access for closing in on 2 years now. But prior to that, for 30 plus years, I was with a school district down in Florida. And for 6 of those years working for that district, I was the school safety specialist. That followed our mass shooting down at Stoneman Douglas High School. And there was a big push to improve school security in Florida following that event. And I stepped into that role for my district, which, as I said, I did for about 6 years. Prior to that, I was a school administrator and special education support person. So, I've got experience from lots of different vantage points, and one of those is security director.
All right. Well, Jill, thanks for joining us today. And Brian, you want to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Absolutely. Hey, everybody. Thanks, Scott. Pleasure to be on here with you and the other panelists. My name is Brian Gard. Have a few hats to tell you about here. My first part of my career was spent with the large law enforcement agency here in the state of Michigan. Spent 12 years there. Then I transitioned to the director of safety and health for National Heritage Academies. We're one of the largest public charter school networks in the country. We have 100 schools in 9 different states. I oversee the operational aspects of that. I also serve on the board of directors for PASS, and I have reviewed several grants or rounds of stop grants through DOJ. Not only applied to grants myself, but also been a peer reviewer. So as we dreamed up what this would look like, I'm bringing a few different hats to bring to the panel. So thanks, Scott.
All right. Well, thanks, Brian. I appreciate it. And hopefully, like I said, we'll have Guy Grace, who's the K-12 National Program Manager for ASA Abloy. Before that, spending over 35 years in Littleton, Colorado as the Director of Emergency Management and Operations, and really putting together what they put together as kind of a model for school districts that we've worked with for many, many years. And then Elisa Mula, who's the president of EMD, who help schools as far as looking at those fundings, how to put those fundings together. And so hopefully we will see them very soon. So I'm going to go ahead and get us kicked off. So really what we wanted to do on this
Scott,
in this
excuse me. I'm
webinar.
sorry. I'm
Yeah,
sorry, Scott. Guy is on the call. If you want to let Guy say a few words.
yeah, that'd be great. Guy, go ahead.
Thank you. We live in a technology challenging world. We look at Zoom and how we had to sign in and the security measures that Zoom put in for us to use it. But I'm honored to be here. I am a retired school security director. I worked for 34 years in the state of Colorado, 31 years of Littleton Public Schools. My official title was Director of Security and Emergency Planning. And obviously, for folks here that are attending this webinar, we all know that grant funding and is multi-layered, multi approaches to it, and often too it can appear to be like a unicorn for maybe many of us in school safety. So this endeavor here is what we're trying to help folks to understand how to utilize those multiple lanes of school safety for funding. Obviously, I now work in the security industry as in hardware and access control. But I would say to folks that are attending this webinar today that we are, and the tools we created are multifaceted. We are looking at how the past layers of safety and security can help with the layered security approach, human roles and processes, district policies and procedures, mental health, security technology, and going from the local, state, and federal funding. So I'm honored to be here, and thank you for dealing with my technology challenges of the internet. Thank you.
All right. Well, Guy, glad you're here. So, and Elisa, I think she is coming on here pretty soon. Elisa, I didn't see you in your bubble, but are you there? Okay. Hopefully we will see Elisa here very soon. All right. So with that, let me go ahead and get us started with our PowerPoint here and what we're looking to do for funding for school security, really using the past Rev 7 guidelines and how to kind of put that framework together, looking at the different grants that are available out there, as well as how you can kind of help build that narrative using a national standard like PASS to help with your funding and help with your grant writing process. So one of the things that we kind of talk a little bit about is when we start with Red 7, it's not looking at a shopping list. It's really looking at those layers of security and how do you create that narrative to show the gaps that you have, as well as how this is going to help implement and help enhance the safety and security that you have. So, Guy, I'm going to kind of kick it off to you. Can you give us just kind of a download of the importance of using the PASS assessment as a practitioner and how they can use the PASS guidelines, and really when you're working with that narrative, how you bring a holistic approach?
So I want to take the approach here, and many of the stakeholders that are attending this presentation today or will be looking at this presentation in the future. Security is a multi-layered. Applying for grants and implementing security and safety improvements in your schools is a multi-layer approach. We have to look at the human roles and processes. We have to use how the technology is going to impact the learning environment, and it has to be comprehensive when we do it. So when we look at the PASS Revision 7 guidelines, what we are doing is we are making recommendations for how you would cover your district-wide layer. So that would be from your educational service center, your headquarters, or if you're in a school, your administrations at the school. And then we look at the digital infrastructure. For that's important to note, the digital infrastructure, our learning environment is often centric and relies on that digital infrastructure, but also many of the technologies and other components we put in school must unify with the digital infrastructure. So that's a little bit complicated. And we need these things to be functioning as holistically, and interoperability must be sustained and must be possible at all times. But then we get into the campus perimeter. For example, those are places like our athletic fields, our parking lot, our green spaces, that exterior of the building, for example. And those are multifaceted. We have crime prevention through environmental design, how that's going to impact how we do the outside of the school, but how we're going to implement these components in there holistically. We're not trying to turn schools into prisons. That's most important. What we're doing holistically is making these places a welcoming place, but harmoniously working together. So when we get into the building perimeter, we look at the access control of the school, the visitor management, the entry points into the schools. We think about how we're going to flow our students into the school, how we're going to flow egress out, for example. But also, too, we must think of the emergency situations, such as law enforcement, first responders that need to get into school for emergencies. And then we get into the classroom interior. And this is so important, too, just as every other layer, we get into where our staff, our students, and our community are inside being taught, uh, teaching, but also, too, where our community use is being into the schools. We look at a school, our schools are typically open, for educational purposes. However, they are often the flagship of the community, and there's all kinds of components that we need to think about. A school can be open 18 hours a day, even 20 hours a day, 7 days a week, and it's being used for multiple purposes. So we have to think holistically how a layered security approach is going to be applying into that school. So when you look at that, every funding ready request should answer what layer is being affected, what is the current condition and target condition, and what project or sequence of the projects will close the gap. But also, too, we're going to talk about this. There's so many stakeholders in K through 12. It's not just me as a security director or Jill, somebody in those roles. It's the whole tiered process, the whole team, holistically. Our athletic director, our education directors of K through of the upper ed, or excuse me, the administration, the junior high, the high schools, the elementary schools. It's the mental health support. It's the SROs. It's that whole interoperability that we're trying to create. We need to hear all the stakeholders. But we also need to think, how will these improvements be sustained after we award them? And that's so important in what we're doing in K through 12 safety and security.
All right. Well, Guy, thank you. And Elisa, you made it. So thanks for joining us today. You want to introduce yourself just a little bit, and then you got kind of some examples that you have of looking at using the PASS 7 guidelines when looking at grants?
I do, yes. Thank you. Sorry for the technical difficulties. I couldn't join from my laptop, but I'm able to join from my phone, so I'm happy to be here. Again, my name is Elisa Mula. I help schools primarily win a lot of funding through all of these grant programs. This is something I've been very passionate about for a long time. So I love, the fact that we can all come together as an industry and really share some of these best practices and share with folks how they can do this for themselves. So thank you. In implementing some of what Guy just said, because we've had these conversations several times, the PASS guidelines, you cannot get better than the PASS guidelines when pulling together a number of stakeholders and really combing through what are the pain points that we need to hit for our institution. Let's, pick it apart, measure them up against the PASS guidelines. And that is really going to be your roadmap for preparing all of your documentation when applying for a grant. And I think we might touch on a couple of grants today. It's not just for specifically public schools, but there's a lot of private institutions where these PASS guidelines are kind of universal. So what Guy was just saying is bringing in a lot of those different stakeholders, really reviewing those guidelines thoroughly, preparing all the information that's specific to your institution and gathering that intel to start building your grant application documents and really start building your project, your program, regardless of whether or not you win a grant. These are the ways that all of our clients become more defensible in court by saying, we took the best practices, we developed a plan to move forward, and we're incrementally implementing these changes in order to keep our students, faculty, and staff safer.
And I think that's really important as we kind of move into it. So, Elisa, kind of expound a little bit on that, on building that team. So, what is kind of some of your experiences, just kind of on that high level? We can go into it a little bit later on the importance of having that team being brought together.
Yeah. So, when you're looking at who are my stakeholders going to be in this project, it's not something that's going to take a couple of days. This is work that if it's done properly, if you're preparing for a grant and you're doing it properly, this will be over a course of months. And you want to pick team members that are calm, cool, and collected. They're not averse to speaking about security specific topics. And not everybody in your institution is going to be that way. There's definitely folks that either want to really dive into the deep parts of the security practice. And the major goal, if you're applying for a grant, is not necessarily to iron out all of the details, but to get to that finish line, collect all of that data, start building those documents, and then you can move forward with diving into the details once you've won the money. So again, stakeholders who are not adverse to these topics are organized, they're going to work well with everybody else on the team, and they're going to get that information in a timely fashion so you can reach that goal line.
Awesome. Thank you.
I was just going to chime in a little bit about the importance of that team, Scott, and I'll just, air my own laundry, I guess, a little bit. When I first started and was in this place of needing to upgrade my security, the team that I left off, or the stakeholder I left off my team to start with, was IT. And since everything is on the network, they need to be involved, and they can guide the best practice for that to make sure that security equipment that's on the network doesn't interfere with student use of the network, isn't going to go dark when 3 people are looking at the same video, maybe from 3 remote sites. It's really important to have IT as part of that team, and the other stakeholders as well. Elisa makes a really good point with regard to that. So I love that. Start with the team first. And the practices that we're talking about aren't bad for the district anyway. So even if you're not going to be applying for grants necessarily, like, don't do all this because it will help you get a grant. Do all this because it will help you provide a better security profile for your district, right?
Yeah, and I think that kind of leads into this, Jill, of when we're looking at this, of being able to prepare before you apply. So looking at taking that strategic approach. So how did you do that when you were looking at your schools going after some funding? How did you kind of go through that preparation before you started applying?
So a big part of that for me was that assessment. And I went looking for best practices in school security. And I had a lot of things to overcome, right? Antiquated systems, siloed systems that didn't work together, all of those things. And so I needed to start with what the district needed, right? Not what funds were available. Like my starting point had to be with identifying and really being able to articulate our need. That's going to be helpful for any kind of grant, but it's also helpful again for establishing that security process. Then, if you're talking federal grants, and we shouldn't only talk federal grants when we're talking about applying for grants, right, Elisa? I'm not on the wrong track there. But make sure that you're aligning with what the federal government says we should be doing, right? So that you have a better chance then of winning that federal grant if you're thinking about things from that perspective. And we've got to meet the requirements that they're looking for. Let me say it that way better. Next, though, you should build that team within and build a common vision for the security profile that you're trying to build. So if everyone's on the same page, Lisa mentioned stakeholders being able to articulate this message so that if I am at a school board meeting talking about this, it isn't just me. If they go and ask IT, if they go and ask law enforcement partners, if they go and ask principals, are we all on the same page about what our needs are and the direction that we're going? That gets us into better position to have that ongoing support that's needed. Then, are we ready for that solution? And I'll tell you about another mistake that I made was that I bought into a solution that was at a higher tier. And what I needed to be focusing on was a lower tier, so that I had the basics down first. And then layer on those other, like analytics, for example. If you've got holes in your perimeter, your focus probably shouldn't be on adding analytics to your cameras. And then make sure that your district or your governing entity is capable of receiving that grant and then managing it, helping to manage it, and has the financial standing to be considered as a good risk for the government to give that money out to, right? So that they know how to manage getting and paying out federal funds.
I think that's
Bill, I wanted to.
Yeah, you want to jump into it, Brian?
Yeah, go back to the previous. I just want to reinforce a couple of comments that Jill made on the other slide there. That one, Scott. Yeah. I can't stress how important it is, for maybe the new school safety director out there that has an opportunity for grant funding. It can be very distracting to your true north goals. You get a shiny object, you get a large pot of money, and you get vendors that have legitimate products that can probably solve your solutions. But if you do not have the fundamentals in place, it doesn't matter how great or lofty the situation is, it's still not going to define you. So start with, not to beat on a dead horse with the PASSK guidelines, but use those as that fundamental baseline so you can build off of that, so you don't get distracted by the shiny object. It happens to all of us. You go to a conference, you see some really great technology, you want to implement it, and you get too far out ahead of something, and the next thing you know, you've got some gaps in your program because you're too focused, and it's becomes a resource dependent project. Certainly a lesson learned on my end as well, Jill. So that's well said.
May I add something to that, Brian? That's
absolutely
a really great point. The large majority of the schools that we work with and that are going after funding, they tend to come to us with, and this is not a knock on them, it's a mixed match of technologies. Often those technologies are not speaking to each other. And it's partly due to the lack of funds that they've had over the years and trying to fill the gaps as best they can. Often they don't have the resources or the security professionals to, close up those seams and have the interoperability that we're all hoping for. And so they're doing the best with the resources they have. But what they don't realize is over time, when you have multiple technologies that are not integrated, that actually inhibits your emergency response. So then when they're faced with the opportunity to go out and get funding, again, the natural inclination is to say, okay, let's get some new upgraded technology, when if you actually follow the PASS guidelines and really look through, what is that best next step? It is seaming everything together, making it all interoperable, and something that Jill touched on, from a cultural standpoint, really making sure everyone in the institution understands, like, yes, we have a basis of design, we have an operation SOP that really works with our technology. So it's no longer, our emergency response is no longer inhibited by the technology we're utilizing. It's actually enhanced. We're able to respond better, quickly, more efficiently. So just having that perspective after really digesting those PASS guidelines, it just helps you do more with the opportunity that you have when you do in fact win these funds.
Outstanding, Elisa. Thank you so much. So
Thanks.
Brian, briefly kind of talk a little bit about that common drift, just kind of where we are, where we're looking at this and sharpening that strategy. You talked a little bit about that there in your previous comments, but
Yeah, sure. I guess I'd like to put on the optics of a reviewer, and it's a competitive grant type situation. And the insights that I have as a peer reviewer in the grant cycles that I've done is grants having well-intentioned meaning, but not having a clear vision and picture, and or documented it really well. So, trying to solve multiple problems, as Elisa was just talking about, trying to do too much with it. So I think picking up, like the bullet points talk about, separate what it is that you exactly need, be very specific with what your goals are, how you're going to articulate those goals in a short and concise way, and making sure that the reviewers on the back end understand where exactly you're going in a way that you can communicate in sometimes only a few paragraphs or a few pages due to limitations on some of the grants. So being honest with the things that you have. You don't want to over promise, over deliver, or under deliver with something, because there are requirements in some grants to from the reporting standpoint. So you don't want to make a bunch of promises that you can't keep. So that's something that is really important to do.
outstanding. And when we look at that, and it kind of dovetails into what you're saying, Brian, when we're sharpening that strategy, is that there are different funding lanes that are out there. So Guy, can you kind of touch a little bit just on that high level view of those fundings that are available to our schools, and what are the ones that we target depending on what it is we're looking to do in security?
Well, so first of all, I'm going to say security to me is emergency preparedness, security, but it's also holistically applying all of the needs into a school district. So when I think of technology, I'm also thinking of mental health. I'm thinking of behavioral threat assessments. I'm thinking of the whole big picture, which is so important. So often here in PASS, we talk a lot about the technology side, but we also include that human element, the realization that what we're bringing to the school is, most importantly, we're serving the human beings that are learning and using our educational spaces. So when we look at the funding sources, we look at the local community, and that could be our capital and our long range work that we're doing with the funds that we're provided by the state or by our tuition if we're a private school, or our membership. And then we look into the federal competitive grants. Now, we often hear about the DOJ grant, the COPS grants, when we're school security directors. But we also have many other grants, for example, or several other grants that go into mental health. They go into threat management. They go into emergency preparedness. We look at our private education facilities. They can apply for grants to, if they're a nonprofit and serving the community, they can utilize those grants for their facilities. And then there's the state grants. Now we hear a lot about the federal competitive grants, right? But the majority of the grants are coming from the state level, for example. And that's something that we need to be cognitive of. Many folks or some folks are not aware of the state grants often, and they're become aware of it when it's too late. And this is, every kind of the funding that we hear, we have to have an awareness on it, right? We have to be on top of it. And like it was described by Jill and Elsa in earlier, for example, is having those teams and all those teams members being alert and cognitive of what is going on in their verticals so we can bring these practices to the schools. And then there's the formula of district planning. Now, we look at probably the biggest lifeblood for security technology in our school districts across the country is bond initiatives. Okay. For me, bond initiatives in my district is probably what funded most of the security technology that we put in there. But, I don't call it a grant, but I call it funding because we have to educate our community because they have to vote on that, right? So those things that, having that team and doing it holistically as much as possible, you're going to be able to communicate to your public about your needs. But I'm going to say another thing. There's, one of the main grants was a SERV grant, for example, that we applied for after we had an active shooter incident in one of our schools. And that helped us to recover after the aftermath of that school shooting. And what I mean by that is we were able to fill the mental health gaps. We were able to do some repairs on our facilities that the person was damaged by the person that attacked us, but in addition to the law enforcement and responder response. So those are out there to help school districts recover. It doesn't have to just be an active shooter incident. You could have a weather emergency, something that destroyed your facilities. You could have had some damage to your infrastructure, some natural hazards. So they're out there as well. But also too, the trauma support is so important because schools nowadays are being called upon to support for many, many years these poor folks that go through these tragedies, and they're doing that support. And so there is funding available out there for that. And when we look at non-public and nonprofit specific, they're out there, as I mentioned, as well. And you look at like places that a private school or a other organization, a religious affiliated school, they can sometimes, if they do this appropriately, go with their lanes, identifying non-public, nonprofit specific grants and funding. So our instinct here is going back to that team. And when we look at the tool that we're going to provide here later on, we're going to help folks identify those resources that we are identifying in these 6 funding lanes.
Thank you, Guy. And Elisa, I know that was one thing that we had talked about a little bit too, about some of the nonprofit, where's the funding for guys like Brian? We
So
talk a lot about state and federal. So
yeah, no, there is a lot of funding out there, both at the state and federal levels that are not simply the COPS, SVPP, the school violence prevention. There's also the hiring program. So if you need school resource officers, you want to work with local law enforcement, go after that. Guy mentioned mental health. That all, plays a role. And then there's a lot of times where public safety grants can actually assist in areas where there are schools. We worked with a law enforcement agency not that long ago where there was a major intersection right near a school, and drop-off pickup was a problem. And so they were able to utilize public safety funds to make that entire situation at that major intersection where most parents were coming through to drop off and pick up their kids part of the overall infrastructure for the school and school safety. So there's a lot of money out there. The one thing I will caution people is to really understand what grant you're going after and what the rules and guidelines are. So if we have many customers that are going after both federal and state level grants in the same fiscal year. And now there are often rules that if you're asking for money for, let's just say, surveillance equipment from one grant, you cannot ask for money for surveillance equipment from another grant. So just make sure you know what those rules are. There's plenty of folks out there, whether they're at the DOJ or FEMA, that can answer these questions for you. If you're struggling and you need some guidance, you can certainly look up under the FEMA website the state administrative agent list. It has an entire list for every state in the country and the corresponding representative. You can reach out to them and they're there to guide you and give you this information, point you in the right direction. So, take that team that you've built and really start planning. Which grant are we going after this year? Which one are we going after next year? Would they conflict with each other? How should we spread out our funding requests? Because you could make this an ongoing project of just continuously winning grant funds depending on what's available for you.
And I think that kind of dovetails nicely into kind of the main federal grants. Can you just briefly, like just in a couple minutes, Elisa, just kind of tell us what these grants are and what are some of the security things that they help with?
Yeah.
With the
So
funding.
Yeah, so you have the SVPP on here, obviously. That's primarily for public K through 12s and really focused more on the equipment or deterrent measures, as they would say. And deterrent measures is a little bit of a vague term, but for the large majority of the customers that we work with, it is in fact, physical security equipment, surveillance equipment, metal detectors, access control, stuff like that. The STOP grant does really focus on, as you say here, prevention, threat assessments, reporting, training. Training is a big deal. Most people sort of overlook the training aspect when they think about what are we doing with our security programming. You can put the latest and greatest technology in your school, but if you don't know how to use it or your entire faculty and staff are not properly trained on those SOPs, it's not really going to help you, right? So training is a huge piece of it. What's not listed here, I am going to mention it really quickly, is the nonprofit security grant program. That is for private schools, nonprofits, any organization that is a nonprofit that could be at higher risk for terrorist activity. So a lot of, private schools, houses of worship, even charter schools, they are even offering additional points for anyone from the secular medical space, right? So, that's one that's not on the list. The Homeland Security grant that's on here, same thing, definitely focused on that preparedness and resilient factor from the lens of how can we upgrade our overall security posture. Each one of these, I highly encourage everybody to start evaluating. And again, under the COPS banner, that DOJ banner, don't simply rely on that SVPP grant. There are so many other grants that these schools can start exploring, whether it's the hiring program or STOP. But there's a question in here. I don't know if we want to jump into that. Do we want to save the questions for later or on the Homeland Security?
I was going to ask you to talk about, Scott might not have seen it, but the one from Kevin would be a perfect one. I think that one. We can talk about Liz's question later.
Does somebody want to just read Kevin's question real quick?
Yeah. Is there any restriction on which schools can apply for these grants? And so can we have a ballpark idea of the amounts of different options?
Okay, so amounts, that's a great question. The School Violence Prevention Program does have a match. It's a 25% match, and they will fund up to $500,000 of your project. There are micro grants included in that SVPP bucket. So anything, I believe, under $100,000, you do not have to have a match for, which is great news because we have definitely seen some public K through 12s that have very little funding and can't come up with that match, but still need this money. So if you can fit your project in that micro grant under $100,000 bucket, you can apply. The NSGP for private institutions, private schools, that is up to $200,000 per building and up to 3 buildings in a single fiscal year. There is no match for that grant. We've seen a lot of private schools, charter schools apply for that and win multiple grants in a single year. So, not just 200,000, up to 400, possibly even $600,000. The Homeland Security grant, I'm sorry, the dollar amount is escaping me, but there was a first part to that question. Are there any restrictions? There are some restrictions. So you first and foremost have to be eligible for that grant. So if we're talking about the SVPP, you have to, in fact, be a public school district. Now, if you go on their website, it could seem a little bit misleading because there are tribal communities that can apply, law enforcement groups that can apply, but the primary award winner for those grants are, in fact, public K through 12 school districts. On the nonprofit side, you do have to be a nonprofit. You do have to prove that you are at higher risk for terrorist activity. And quite honestly, that one is much more flexible. You have a lot more flexibility as long as you can prove your case, the need for this equipment. And, you know, as Brian was saying, that you have a proper plan in place to execute. So they want to make sure that whoever they're awarding this money to, and this is across all of the grant programs, SVP, Homeland Security, and NSGP, they want to make sure if we are giving you this money, you are going to steward it properly. It's going to get spent according to the grant guidelines. So whatever grant you are going after, take the time, do a little bit of a deep dive on what the requirements are, what the guidelines to spend the funds are, and then reach out to the state administrative agent. You can ask them any question you want. That is their job, is to give you those guidelines and really explain the process to you so that you know what you're getting into.
Thank you, Elisa. I think that's outstanding information. So really appreciate it. Guy, I'm going to ask you just kind of real quick on the mental health aspect of it. Just if you can spend just a couple of minutes when we're looking at this on how that is part of the security and sometimes part of that grant process.
Well, it's very very, very important because what we're talking about is the human beings, that the students that are in our schools, for example. And it's great for us to get ahead of this to where, you know, when we're looking at a layered security approach, maybe we can prevent, deter, deny something from happening before it happens. So as we go back to that team of stakeholders, for example, a well-designed security system, safety system in your school district is going to be inclusive of the mental health side. And it's so important for us to realize that when we're hardening a school, that we're not just hardening the school, we're heartening the school by taking into account the mental health interventions, the wellness and the climate and culture. So when we look at this, we think about the practitioners that would be in there, your special education director, your school psychologist, your mental health practitioners that work in your schools, the counselors that do the counseling. But this is so important as well because a well-designed system, again, is holistic as much as possible, that we are making, not turning our schools into prisons, but making them into a place that is welcoming and secure as much as possible, and not deterring our learning environment. You know, we look at our return of investment in K through 12, you know, like where I'm in the business side is how, you know, how much we do to bring a profit, but the return of investment for K through 12 is getting our kids to the next levels to be productive adults, whatever that may be. And we must realize that. So when we look at that, the school-based mental health services, grants like Project Aware, TIS, Project Prevent, and most importantly, as we will see in our tool later on, is using the grants finder tool when that team is in place, for example, to not only to look for grants, but I want to emphasize, going back to what was said earlier, that team of stakeholders internally and externally is so important for your school to have in place, not only for grants and funding, but to ensure the safety and security practices are deployed holistically and your return of investment of the kids getting to the next level is met. So when they're there, you do this because, as it was stated, if you don't do this, and you harden, you don't do this part, you're really kind of putting yourself in a bad spot. So what needs to be done is so holistically and creating that interoperability between your mental health stakeholders and the processes and procedures and the policies that you put in place is to make them work as important. But I would also say, You've seen one school. You've seen one school. Everything is different. You could have a district that's exactly the same, but every one of those schools is going to have different needs, climate and culture, demographics, you name it. There's something when you're doing this, it has to be holistically applied to campus to campus to campus. But most importantly, you cannot go against each other. That's one of the biggest problems we see in K through 12 is we have silos often. And folks say, my endeavor works more than the other endeavor. But what I would challenge people here with this is to make sure that when one component fails, that other component steps up to deter, detect, and deny whatever that failure may be or emergency situation may be. So we must do this holistically. So don't just focus on the technology side. Put it into, look at your mental health side closely and as constructively as much as possible and create and build from there.
All right. Well, Guy, appreciate that. We're going to kind of go past our break here since we started a little bit late. So, and I think it kind of dovetails into really what you were just saying, Guy, building that culture of safety. And it's not just with the um, equipment that we might be doing or the personnel we're putting in place, but really having that holistic to give us more of that. So when we look at from the concerns that we have to a real, to a real project, how how do we take what the goals we want to have and apply them into a strong narrative?
The question is that for myself or Jill?
I would love to hear Scott's answer to that as well as Guy's. I think Scott,
Okay.
being a reviewer in that aspect, would have a lot of insight.
Okay. Scott, go first. I'd love to go off of what you say there.
Alyssa,
And
was that for me?
hopefully it looks like I might be having some connection issues. So hopefully you guys.
Can you hear me, Guy?
We can hear you.
Yeah. Were you talking? Did you want me to comment on that, or was that for Scott? We probably should just keep going.
There's a little bit of an internet flux here. So when I look at this is holistically is, when we look at the needs of a district, again, it's going to vary from school to school. We look at schools across our districts. You may have a more modern facility. You may have an older facility. There's a lot of mix match in that. We could look at the culture and climate as different into a school. And what we need to do is we need to identify the common concerns as they applied. So we look at, you could have one school with really good access control, but then you could have a school with uncontrolled access control. And the key point to this is what we emphasize in Rev 7. We've always emphasized that the leading practice in PASS is a risk assessment before going forward with identifying what our needs are. It must be identified on risk. So when you look at this slide right here, we're looking at things that have been identified by risk. And this is some of many. Uncontrolled access, legacy systems, inconsistent preparedness, gaps in threat assessment, fragmented ownership, and that can go into, when we go into our funding narratives and how we're identifying that, we're going to look at project ready packages, visitor entry as an example, building perimeter. We're also going to look at things like our digital resilience, our interoperability, our prevention, our classroom interior protective capabilities, our dress and emergency communications. There is these are just some of the many components that we need to evaluate. And I'd love to hear the rest of the team go on that.
Well, I would just chime in and talk about resilience, digital resilience, and interoperability. We've heard the stories about the ransomware attacks and things like that. schools are vulnerable to that as well. So having devices on the network that are cyber secure is really important, and upgrading that resiliency and that level of cybersecurity is fundable through grants, not just federal grants, but through some other grants as well. And that's really huge, right? We don't want to hang devices on our network that allow, hackers to get in and access either our staff or student data, or our financial data for our school districts as well. So that all needs to be protected. So what some of the questions people ask about and think about as they're getting ready for this is, are we at a place to use this technology securely? Right? We don't want to hang devices that make our students, staff, or visitors more vulnerable than they were before we hung them. Right? That's going in the opposite direction. It's important questions to ask of vendors when they're making pitches about things as well. Will it work with our existing legacy systems? Will it also provide those layers of protection?
That's
Brian, did you
outstanding,
have any
Jill.
thoughts
Brian,
on
do you want to,
that?
Brian,
Yeah,
do you want to
Brian.
weigh in on this?
Yeah, I don't know if I have anything else deeper than what you guys have said. I think the main points would be knowing what you're going after, being articulate with what you're doing, and know that you need to have a plan in place to do that. So
One last thing I would say when you're doing this is look at sustainability. That's so important. If I'm going to put these projects together, we look at grants. Often they, especially when it's the personnel, it only might last a couple of years. When you're going for this, you look at this, how am I going to sustain that? And that would be the closing comment for that. Sustainability is so important for K through 12. We're in a very an environment where things are here and then suddenly they're gone. And often that's due to grants. Does that make sense? So, all right. So we'll do our 5-minute break and then go to the tool.
No, I think we're going to
Oh,
go ahead and skip our 5-minute break since we've
Okay.
started about 6 minutes late. So we're going to kind of continue and push on through this. So hopefully I am back up and running. So when we talk about a kind of a pass the line grant, and Brian, I'm going to kind of throw this to you as you are either putting a grant together or reviewing a grant, what is kind of that strong narrative sequence that helps when we're putting this together to kind of show that holistic approach? I know we talked a little bit before on how that grant should be, kind of all encompassing if we possibly can, to make sure that it's not fragmented or siloed.
So this isn't going to apply to everything or all grants. I would say the slide that Elisa talked about and had different opportunities for grants. It's going to depend on what you're doing, whether it's a local, state. But I would say if it's a competitive grant with rules of what I would call engagement or rules of submission, you need to make sure that you're being very holistic and specific with the things in mind that they're asking. As a peer reviewer, you're tasked with maybe a dozen applications. You're given a deadline. You're given a checklist of what exactly is looked at or asked for in each of the sections. And you're limited as a reviewer with the information that you're provided by the grant or by the applicant. So sometimes well-meaning districts have probably been passed over for well-meaning needed things because they just didn't take the time to set up the grant for success. So if I'm going to spend my energy or time on a grant, I'm going to make sure that probably this workflow is going to be one of the slides that I'm probably going to speak the most about on this whole webinar. So understanding the scope, we've already talked about the layers, how to assess, build your team, all that is really important. Number 2 would be the assessing from the grant standpoint, the decision maker ownership, or just kind of going through the boxes on the screen there. Knowing where you're going after, and then that gap project and outcome. Let's spend a moment talking about that because there's so many opportunities that people miss because they just don't take the time to follow. Some really clear examples would be, the grant requires A guy talked about, what is the sustainability? That's often a grant question. How are you going to sustain the project? You're going to get all this money. What are you going to do with it when it's done? And most people just say, we'll figure it out when it's over with. That's not, from a grading standpoint, you need to put some consideration into what it is that you're going to explore. Sometimes it asks for who's in charge of the grant. You need to add resumes, talk about what other things that they've done well, what other grants that they've led, what other bigger projects that they've led. If you're doing a partnerships and the grant asks for MOUs, make sure you include an MOU, no matter if it's a little extra work or not. If they're asking for details on the finances around this, there's often that fundamental finance section that needs to be both narrative form and also the Excel spreadsheet form that you need to justify all the P's and Q's that you're asking for so you can do those things appropriately. So I don't want to overstate the importance of understanding exactly what is asked and being very specific, because the grant reviewers are forced to rank order their answers based on the criteria that they're given and how they interpret it. So the easier you can make it, the more clear you can make it, the more successful that you're going to likely be. There you go, Scott.
All right. Well, thank you, Brian. How about Elisa? Do you have some comment on that you'd like to put in some of the experience that you've seen?
I do. And, we sort of pick brains of people like Brian to really sort of understand how they are evaluating some of these documents. We've spoken to a number of applicants that, they don't necessarily understand, well, even though there's not a requirement for an assessment, sometimes if they will allow you to submit supporting documents, you might want to include that assessment. But whatever it is that you're including, whether it's a required document or a supporting document, as Brian said, if the grant reviewer can't clearly connect the dots between all the information that you're submitting for him to review, it's most likely going to get discarded. It's going to get overlooked. So as you're writing everything, whether it's a narrative, an assessment, in the case of the school violence prevention, there's an SF424 document with a whole bunch of questions. You really have to be clear and concise and have your team members review your work. Because when you're answering a question or you're writing a narrative, it may make sense to you, but to a third party who is reviewing what you've written might not necessarily be clear. So utilize those team members to, cross-check what you're including, and then edit out anything that is not important. We see a lot of applications from our customers that have applied previously. And when we're rewriting their documents, we'll say, in this particular case, the fact that you have a homeless population across the street might not necessarily be relevant for this particular grant. Let's just hone in on the things that the grant reviewer really wants to see. Was there any anti-Semitic writing on the building, or a neighboring community that's had gang violence, or whatever it is? Really hone in on the things that the grant reviewer is going to score you on. And if you don't know that it's relevant, you may want to consider leaving it out, because they only have so much time to review everything, and you want the important information that you're going to get scored on to stand out. So I think Brian really said it well. The other thing, and I know we're really talking about the grant application portion, but when you're building your documents, a lot of these documents, either, let's just say you don't get the award on the first try, you're going to take those documents and refresh them and apply again. You should. If you do all of that work, and it is a lot of work, you want to refresh them and apply again that next year. But as you're applying, the goal again is, regardless of whether you get the funding or not, you want to continuously, incrementally improve your security posture for your school. And you also want to be defensible in court. Every time we work with a customer, we're writing their documents, we're letting them know these are the things, these are the small incremental measures that you can put in place so that if an event happened, you feel confident enough that you've, referenced PASSK guidelines or other industry standards, and you're doing everything in your power regardless of the funding that you have in place, everything in your power to keep those community members safe, right? So when you have that clear vision, it will come across in your grant documents. You will score higher on the grant application. You'll have a higher likelihood of winning that funding and a really strong plan to implement that vision once you get the funding and the award.
So I think I hear a lot of what you're saying, Elisa, and Brian as well, is, from my experience from the integrator side, is a lot of times we look at that grant or we look at that bond of, this is what we can do to get this small portion done, without really discussing and making sure that we're strategic in saying, this is just a one step in our marathon of school safety and
Right.
security, and how we can be clear and concise to that in the grant to say, this is how that funding is going to help us to take it just to this next level, so that we
Yeah.
can go here, that we can go here, and making sure that we're bringing that narrative to them in a convincing way.
And if you show them that you have that plan, not just for next year or the next 5 years, but the next 10, 15, 20 years, you have that continuous maintenance and team to stay on top of it. That's going to be a good narrative for someone to award money to say they know what they're doing and they have a plan for the long term. That's my opinion. Maybe Brian might say something different.
So, kind of going into that then, and as we went through this, we've talked a lot about where those state and federal grants are, but that private independent funding, Elisa, you had mentioned it there, about looking at some of the faith-based ones, of how we look at that key message of what it is that we're looking at. Not only when we're looking for which grants to go after, but what that messaging should be. Could you speak a little bit about that, a little more, Elisa?
Absolutely. So there are a number of states that have hate crime grants, and those are going to really be targeted for specific members of the community that would have a higher likelihood of encountering that kind of negative behavior. So you really want to, dig into whatever the guidelines are for that fiscal year. And this could change from fiscal year to fiscal year. So great example of this is there were a lot of institutions that were faith-based, and after October 7th, we're implementing some language around, we have a large Jewish population, we have some concerns, or maybe the surrounding areas could be a little hostile based on what happened recently in Israel. So you want to pick apart what's important for that particular fiscal year, and every year there is an announcement for whatever grant you're going after. Read through those announcements, see if they are awarding additional points for one reason or another, and how can that be incorporated into your actual application, whether it's something like a hate crimes grant, which is mostly at the state level, or if it's in fact a federal nonprofit security grant. Even those, from year to year, they will award additional points to specific demographics. You want to know what they're looking for that fiscal year. Even though the documentation might not necessarily change all that much, the application itself or the requirements from a documentation standpoint, there are some nuances from year to year. You want to really dig and investigate and find out what are the hot buttons for them that year, and can it be incorporated into our specific assessment or answers in our investment justification. So those two grants, I would definitely highlight: the FEMA Nonprofit Security Grant Program and any state level hate crime grants. I will say also, most people don't realize this, the FEMA grant is probably one of the more well-funded grant programs out there when it comes to K through 12s. When you look comparatively at the school violence prevention program, that last year gave $73 million. Last year, FEMA's NSGP, all the ones that the private schools went to, that they allocated $250 million. And then the year prior, it was closer to $500 million. So there's a lot of opportunity for not just public schools, but a lot of private schools as well. So don't overlook that one.
I think that's a really good point. As I've looked at some of the grants and seeing how I've seen schools use like the FEMA grant and a bond issue together to be able to
Mm-hmm.
do a lot of the stuff that they were looking to do so that they could work with that. And Jill, I know you've had some experience, on some of the statewide grants and some of the things you've seen there. Can you speak a little bit on what your experience has been?
Well, yeah, first off, I would say that if there are available state grants, and one way to check on that is using the grant finder. The link is right there on the screen. I would say this though, that I was on there just this morning, and there is a message that says it's not being maintained right now with some of the funding issues. So that site might be a little bit behind time. So look locally as well. But one of the things that was true for me, certainly I was awarded both a federal grant and multiple state grants. Um, but state grants tend to be a little less complex in the application, a little less complex in the reporting, a little quicker to get the funding. Often it's passed through and it'll come just as a block right down to the district. So those make the state and local grants a little bit more friendly to apply for, receive, and manage. And also, then you can build relationships at the state level and at the local level with folks that are harder to do on the federal side, right? I mean, as a grant recipient, I had one, and I guess this was pretty unusual, but I had one grant manager at the federal level at DOJ throughout my entire grant period of 3 years. I think that was unusual, but it was good because then we did get to have a connection. State and local, that's almost a built-in. So don't be afraid to ask questions. Don't be afraid to check in and see whether or not there is an applicable grant, or if there's something you could do to be awarded those. Often, too, state grants are not competitive. They are allocation based, and as long as your application meets the minimum requirements, the award comes. So that again makes it a little bit easier to do. Also, build relationships with your superintendent and your board, so that they can, if they are queried by folks from the state, they can speak in support of what you're doing and not respond with a "I don't have any idea what you're talking about" comment, right? You want to make sure they're all on the same page. And I just want to say this about reviewers locally in-house. Your risk managers for your district or your school, they are particular in language use. They are good reviewers to give you some good feedback on whether or not that grant application looks good, and thinks if they think it will improve the security profile and standing. Then you get their support as well, which is also very helpful as you're going on. And what I was good at doing, and I don't say those kinds of things about myself very often, but I will say this: I was good at taking the money from the different pots and making that work together for me. So if I had local funding that I could pair with a grant, it's required for the SVPP grant, but it's a good practice to build in all of the rest of them. So, make those relationships is going to be the really important piece of that.
That is awesome, Jill. So I think one of the things, just to kind of wrap this up, so we want to be able to get to questions on this, is when we do that decision test, when we look at, we're about ready to do that grant, that sort of thing. Elisa and maybe Brian, both of you can comment just briefly on what are some of those. We're seeing some questions here, what we should look at, but what are some of those things of make sure you do this before we hit submit? Elisa, you want to start us off?
Yeah, absolutely. So again, the planning piece of it, if you have a committee that you can, once the announcement comes out for whichever the grant is that you're applying for, you take that announcement, you reach out to the grant governing body ask all the questions that you have. Can we spend money on this type of equipment? Can we also apply for another grant in this way? Ask all of your questions, start preparing those questions now. So the minute the grant window opens or the announcement is made, you get all those questions ironed out right up front. This is the other thing I can't stress enough. You want to be prepared as you possibly can with all of your questions answered prior to the grant application window opening. Jill just mentioned some grants are not competitive, others are. You want to be first in line. You want to have everything well documented. You don't want to be preparing all of the necessary collection of documents and information at the last minute and squeaking your application in right under the deadline. This is stuff you can start doing right now, or even, quite honestly, at the beginning of the year, long before the grant window opens. So pull last year's notice of funding and take a look at what the requirements are, what their guidelines are, what some of the hot topics were for last year, and start preparing and building those documents now. And then once that announcement comes out, collect those questions, speak to the grant department, ask all your questions, and be ready to go.
Lisa, I'll just real quickly on that. I think that's very wise for people. Hopefully they took note of that advice to have a plan. You shouldn't start figuring this out when the grant is posted. You should be thinking a year or two out forwardly about things that you want to upgrade at your school, whatever it might be, and whatever funding source it is. And if it happens to come across from a grant, then you're going to be well primed and positioned to take that. And then from a sales pitch to the grant, the reviewer team, put that in your, say that you've been articulating a plan for the past 2 to 3 years. You've got a plan in place. You've got all the systems, to execute this well. I think that just shows the depth at which people prepare for, and you're more likely to get awarded those competitive grants.
All
Can I
right.
throw one more thing into that too?
Absolutely, Guy. Go ahead.
I'll be
Real
really
quick.
brief. So it's really important too that when we're doing that prior slide, is to make sure that our external stakeholders, especially when we go into a COPS grant, that we are getting them motivated to put that through their chain of command and their structures. Because often that's where districts fail, is when they have to have that third party support that grant. If they don't have that ignition from that side and they're slow about it, you'll lose that grant opportunity. So make sure that your other stakeholders are thoroughly involved and understand that process.
Yeah, and I think bringing it all together here, and then we're going to start asking answering some questions that we've got for the chat, because we want to make sure that we end on time, even though we're a few minutes late. But one of those things that I keep hearing from, the entire group is making sure that, one, we've got to kind of get started early, but two, that we've got this holistic approach, looking at everything from a district-wide level all the way down to the classroom and interior level, and recognizing, in my opinion, and I'm the guy who sells solutions for that's how I feed my family, is all the stuff that is basically from 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. But what's most important is that 1 and 2. Being able to have, these are what our policy and procedures are. These are the people that we have, or even here's some of the people that we need to be able to put in place. And that we have this vision of what we're going to do for our security on a long term, and being able to use that in such a strategic way sounds like that's what's really helping us build some of these grants and to build these narratives to make sure that we're getting success in the grants that we have. And so part of that is how we prioritize, what should we do? Not just focusing on that necessarily system, but how does that system, that process, that MOU, that those people, how does that work towards that holistic approach, and how we're going to increase and enhance our safety, either taking it from a beginning all the way up to a next level. So with that, with the PASS guidelines, just to let everyone know that everything's free that's on the website. So you can go to PASSK12, download all of our guidelines, the checklist, as well as the various white papers that we have. We've had some questions that were in the chat of, will we be able to see the recording of this? The answer to that is yes. There's also going to be a white paper that's coming out that kind of does a very high level of what we've talked about today, as well as a toolkit that's going to be coming out that's really going to help you with that step by step of what some of the things that we've talked about today. So with that, let's dive into the questions. Brian, is there any questions that you saw right off that you wanted to address?
Yeah, let's talk, Liz. There's the chat and there's some in the Q&A. The other one in the Q&A is from Liz. It's what's your perspective on subscription fees for security system and grant funding typically ends, even though the technology can improve school first responder? And I'll just jump on for the sake of time. And then you guys can build if you want to on this. It's that whole sustainability piece. You need to make sure that you understand all of the requirements of the system and whatever platform. And if they have the subscription fees, you need to be thinking about how you're going to pay for it when the grant ends, and also sustainability, or if it's a technology piece, systems break, or if it's a person that you have employed, people are going to get used to that person. And then you have to either figure out how you're going to fund the person, or be very clear up front that the person is only there for a fixed period of time. So I don't have a great answer for you, Liz, other than just be very diligent in what you're approaching, and also create very clear expectations with both the vendor and your customers, if you will, if that's the teacher environment or, the school, making sure that they know that this is a short-term thing to have this particular device or whatever it might be. So, and then
I'll also add that the FEMA does allocate funds for SaaS software. So if you have ongoing services, SaaS related services, cloud storage, whatever, there is a code that you would include in your grant application if you are a nonprofit applying for federal funds.
The only thing I would add to that is echoing a bit of what Brian said. Just be cautious about, if you're doing things as a subscription, what happens if you to that video, for example, what happens to that if you end your subscription? If you don't, do you own it, or does the company own it? That's a really good question to ask, because you might need that video, say, later for a court case or something like that.
Excellent. We had another one in the question and answer. Is there any restriction on which schools can apply for these grants? And can we have a ballpark idea of the amount of the different options?
Elisa hit on that somewhat, Scott.
You want me to go over it real quick?
Yeah, your technical piece. Yeah, maybe if you.
Yep. So for the school violence prevention program, that will award any public K through 12 up to $500,000 for their project. There is a 25% match. So just to break that down, if your project costs $625,000, they will give you up to $500,000, and you have to then cover the rest with your own budget. If it is a micro grant, so if you have a project that costs $100,000 or less, there is no requirement for a match. So you can just, you could have no budget as long as your project is under $100,000. Then at the FEMA level, so the nonprofit school, the private school, the charter school, religious school, that is typically just increase. So I'm saying typically, we're not sure what, fiscal year 26 is going to look like, but it's $200,000 per building, up to 3 buildings. That means physical address, postal address, not just, a separate building with the same physical address. You do have to, in fact, have a separate postal address. So 200,000 per building, up to 3 buildings per fiscal year. And there is no match for that. So you could have absolutely no security budget and still win all of that money. Each of the state grants, they're going to be a little bit different. Some state grants are, on the lower end, we've seen like $50,000, but then there have been some state grants that are, $200,000. So don't discount the state grants. I do agree with Jill that sometimes the state grants are a little bit easier to maneuver, but definitely check if your state has an applicable grant for your institution.
Scott, could I recommend a question we can answer from Mark Hoodie?
Yeah, go right ahead.
Okay, so his question, some of the grants require a threat assessment or risk assessment. Are there practical agencies that are not, so you look at his question, he's asking about a risk assessment. So how we emphasize at PASS, we emphasize the risk assessment. So generally, granting agencies will respond to threat best assessments that are independent, documented, and aligned to recognized frameworks. And that's in our PASS guidelines, Rev 7. It's been in all of our guidelines is that threat assessment, risk assessment is important. They're not vendor driven and they're not product list. A good assessment should be on the findings based on risk and life safety, emergency planning, and implementation readiness. So using the recognized guidance from PASS, schoolsafety.gov resources, and state and school safety centers is your leading practice to implement your question. You will be more successful with a assessment process. And Alyssa, you do that kind of work in your role. Can you explain that more in more detail from Mark's question?
Yeah, so it's always been our general practice not to have any two assessments alike, right? You need to know who your audience is, what the goal of the assessment is. So if we're redesigning a system for a school that's not even asking for a grant, we want to understand what is it that we need to uncover in this assessment. But for grant purposes, the same way as I said before, figure out what the grant that you're going after is looking for. Is it, potential acts of terrorism? Is it just, pure target hardening? And when you're asking the questions that are relevant for that particular grant reviewer, and you're looking at it from that safety and security lens, then you will include those items. In some cases, the grants want to know, what the consequences will be if you don't get the funding. And so you have to include that. We might not necessarily include that information on a regular assessment. So if you're doing your own assessment, there's plenty of tools online. I don't think there's any tool that's better than even the PASS guidelines. So you can literally go line by line on those PASS guidelines and address every
All right. Well, Elisa, thank you. Now, I think we've got time
I
for
think I
one.
lost you guys. Can you hear me?
Yep, there you are. You're back. So
All
I was
right, I
gonna.
cut out. Technical issue.
There you go.
I'm just going to wrap up that last question. So going down the PASS guidelines, make a note of what each guideline states, how it affects your institution, what the answer is based on your institution, and include that in the assessment. You can't go wrong. Then take that information and cross-reference it with the grant that you're applying for and what they're asking of you.
Excellent. All right, one more question, and then we're going to get out of here because we have about 2 minutes left. So this one's kind of two questions in is when are the majority of the grants? When do they open? When do they close? Is there a certain time of year? Or is that one of those things of going to and part of doing this is looking at all of these different resources to find these grants and find out when you apply and so on and so forth?
So I can jump in really quickly. Sorry. So typically, the Q2 timeframe is our busy season with grants, especially at the federal level. Obviously, school violence prevention program, that's the big one that I think most people are interested in. That is usually around the June timeframe. It is different every year. So when that notice of funding comes out, you want to make sure you get it, reach out to them, make sure you're on the list to get that announcement. They will tell you when the deadline is. Last year, there were 2 deadlines, so make sure you capture both of those for fiscal year 26. Mark your calendar, but start preparing now. On the nonprofit security grant program, usually the notice of funding opens up in April or is announced in February, and due dates are roughly around the April timeframe. Last year, it was completely different. The notice came out in July, and all of the subsequent sub-applicant dates for each state trickled out throughout the rest of the year. Very unusual. It could happen again for fiscal year 26. We're expecting that to be announced within the next couple of months. And then at the state and local level, there are grant deadlines, depending on what state you're in, trickled out all throughout the year. So the best thing to do is to connect with the state administrative agent in your state and ask them, do we in fact have a state grant, and what is the rough every year? What's the time frame? But Q2 is always sort of our busy grant season.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Elisa. And Jill, Brian, and Guy, thank you all for taking your time and sharing your expertise today. We are wrapping it up. We'll let everybody know that if you do go to PASSK12.org, under the contact, if we did not get your question answered, please send that in, and that'll get to our group, and we'll be more than happy to do that. Thank you all again for being on this webinar. I know it's a little longer than what we usually do, but this was a pretty important topic with a lot of great information. So thank you again for all of you who was here, and thank you again to my panelists. Y'all be safe.